Meet Steve. In real life, we wouldn't let Steve loose in one of our depots. But for the purpose of this training DVD, we'll let him show you how not to handle freight. Your task is to identify at least 15 bad handling practices that could damage freight, could damage equipment, or could even damage Steve himself. Make notes of these in your workbook. Are you ready? Here goes. So, how did you go? Let's take a look at the action again, only this time I'll highlight the bad practices and Steve will show us a corrected version. Steve isn't wearing a high visibility vest. Steve isn't using a seatbelt, didn't check that an exclusion zone was in place, and didn't look over his shoulder when he was reversing. the reason why he ran over the pallet. Steve is now demonstrating the correct practices. He is wearing a seatbelt and a safety vest and is setting up an exclusion zone. He is also watching carefully as he reverses. In this clip, Steve is driving the forklift erratically and leaves skid marks on the yard. This is a dangerous practice and will cause undue wear and tear on the forklift, could easily damage freight, and cause accidents involving people. Note too the position of the forklift tines, which are too high for movement around the yard or when the forklift is stationary. Mobile phones, including hands-free equipment, cannot be used when you are operating a forklift. This also applies to MP3 players. Steve is now maneuvering the forklift with care and is not using a mobile phone. The forklift tines are adjusted to be as close to the ground as possible at all times when in transit. When stationary and not in use, the forklift tines should be resting on the ground. Here, Steve is rough handling the trailer curtains, is not looking up as he pulls the curtains back, and has only pulled the curtains part way back. He's not considering the position of the straps he has undone, and is leaning one gate against the head of the trailer and just simply throws the other one on the floor. Steve is now demonstrating an approach which is both methodical and takes account of potential health and safety issues. Most importantly, he is looking up as he pulls the curtain back and pulling it back all the way. As he undoes the straps, he's making sure that they're in a position where they will not get in the way when he starts to load freight. He is also stowing the gates correctly. Steve is really giving this freight a rough workover and has a very aggressive driving style. You can see that he is dragging and pushing the freight along the ground. Notice in this clip the down pointing angle of the forklift tines. There is a very good chance that the load would slip off the tines if, for instance, Steve had to brake sharply or ran over some rough ground. Look also at the gap between the load and the heel of the forklift mast. Gaps such as these often lead to an unstable load. Handling freight using an aggressive driving style almost always leads to damaged freight. In this case, the base of the pallet is partly destroyed and one stabilizing foot has completely fallen off. If this pallet is then loaded to a trailer and other freight is loaded on top of it, the whole stack becomes very unstable. Once again, Steve is now using a much more deliberate and methodical approach to the task at hand. He has lined up the forklift tines correctly, has the mast at the correct angle, and there is no gap between the load and the heel of the forklift mast. So he is able to pick this freight up safely in one easy movement. Steve is making a real bad job of loading this item of freight. His coordination is all over the place, the tines are way too high, and he's shown a perfect example of how a rough handling style damages freight. Steve's tines are way too high for this depot movement. Combined with the overall speed of the forklift and the precarious position of the freight, it inevitably comes crashing to the ground. And now Steve commits the ultimate forklift crime, using the equipment for purposes it was just not designed for. Steve loads a heavy item on top of a lighter item of freight. As he does so, he gets too close to the trailer's rubber pelmet, which protects the curtain tracking rail. When these tracking rails get damaged due to severe knocks from forklift mass, they cost more than $5,000 to repair. This is obviously an extreme example, not normally seen in the sending depot. What is often seen though in receiving depots is the results of these types of bad loading practices, where the lighter items on the bottom of a stack have become completely crushed.